Privacy issues have been really hard to get our arms around. It's new, it's evolving. The technologies and the proliferation of data and all the locations where data is accessed and stored and transmitted, it's just hard to keep up with all of that and understand how our privacy obligations apply to all of that. And we're really at the very beginning of this privacy journey in compliance and what the actual impact is to our organizations. And I want to use Apple as an example here as something that we can learn from as far as how we address privacy issues in our organization. Apple was called before the United States House Committee on Energy and Commerce, and this was the regulatory body that oversees these types of privacy issues and consumer issues in relating to a big organization like Apple that is so pervasive in our culture. And so on August 16th, 2018, the government asked the Director of Federal Government Affairs for Apple, do Apple's iPhone devices collect audio recordings of users without consent? And their answer was no. In 2018, Apple's position was, we are not taking recordings, we're not storing those without their consent. But if you think back to being an Apple user in 2018, you're using services like Siri. You're able to say at a moment's notice, hey Siri, and your phone responds to you and listens and understands the terms. You've heard all the stories about people who have accidentally ordered things from Amazon, people who have accidentally called people. Your phone is listening. And so was there proper consent back in 2018? I don't think that the policies and the consent that we all scroll through and click yes on was really adequate. I don't think that it informed us enough about what was actually happening there, because it never made any sense that Apple wasn't collecting that information and storing that information, because it would be so easy for them to do so, because the phone is always listening. It's always having to listen to the words that we're using 24 hours a day in order to be able to respond to that. And so a year later, after that statement was made, a lawsuit was filed alleging that Siri users were being recorded without their consent, and Apple was failing to inform them that that could happen. And so this was a consent issue. And 20 days after that, Apple issued an apology and said that they did in fact have recordings of our Siri commands because they were using that in order to do research, in order to make the service better. And of course they were. If you had thought about that in 2018, in order to make that service work and in order to understand if it was working properly and how to improve it, of course they're going to listen to that and understand it. It just kind of makes sense if you step back and think about it. And so in this case, there were contractors that were listening to these recordings, and the consumer had not given permission for those recordings to be taken and for those recordings to be shared with a third party outside of Apple who was working on the Siri service. And so Apple apologized, and Apple agreed to put a program in place that would make it clear to consumers and give us the right to opt into that, as opposed to doing that by default. And so I think that's a lesson for all of us. We need to think about the kinds of services that we're offering, the kinds of things that we're doing that we need to do in order to make our services better, in order to provide our services, but we've got to communicate effectively with our customers. We have to disclose. There has to be a sense of transparency about how we're using that information. And we need to do a better job of doing that and not doing this default, no, we're not doing that. We're not misusing your information. There's a likelihood that we are misusing the information, and we've just got to find what that is, acknowledge it and own it, and promise to do better. And I do believe that consumers and government agencies will understand that spirit.